This document, as I mentioned previously, was originally compiled by a scholar monk called Venerable Nyanatiloka, but it's since been updated by Ajahn Brahm. So I'll just see if we can get screen sharing on. One second. So you should be able to see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Because, I mean, when we left off previously, we'd been talking about the Four Noble Truths, and we'd spoken about how these Four Noble Truths are basically, they're like a diagnosis and of the symptoms and the cure for, you know, our existential condition, which is that, you know, we suffer. So we talked about the first noble truth being the noble truth of suffering, which has a verb which goes with that, which is that it's to be understood. The second noble truth being the cause of suffering, again, which has a verb, which is that it's to be abandoned. And with any luck today, we should get a chance to go through the third noble truth, which is the cessation of suffering, again, which has the verb which is to be realized. And we'll start talking about the fourth noble truth, which is the way to the cessation of suffering. We won't do it in full because the fourth noble truth being the Noble Eightfold Path, that will then become the theme for the remainder of the next few weeks after that. So I did promise you all one thing from last week. There was a word that I couldn't quite put my hand on last week. The word I was thinking was actually pachaka. So talking about how do we know things in Buddhism, what means of knowledge are valid. So I mentioned the inference as a valid source of knowledge. So we can know something because we've seen a certain number of cases, and we can infer that the remaining number of cases are going to be like that. So an example of that in Buddhism, you know, we can know that greed is bad. Greed causes us pain. And because we've seen that in a limited number of cases in our day-to-day lives, we can legitimately infer that any type of greed for any type of realm is also going to be bad and cause us pain. So that's a legitimate way of knowing things in Buddhism. And the other type of legitimate way of knowing things I mentioned was actually the term I should have used was perception, and the correct Pali term for that, I mentioned the Sanskrit term pratyaksha, but the Pali term is actually pachaka, pati, having the sense of like reflexively oneself, and akka, meaning one's own eyes. So you've seen it with your own eyes, you know, you've had a particular realization that's come out of your own personal meditation experience. And in the context of, you know, when do we have this personal knowledge of our own karma, of our own prior rebirths, in the context of meditation, that can be called reliable when it happens on the basis of a particularly developed meditation state that we refer to as fourth jhana. So I did say I would follow up on that, so I have. So now we can move on with the content. And for anyone who's joining us for the first time this week, please do feel free to make use of the chat box. I'm very open to questions during the presentation because there's a lot of pauses in this document. So we will actually have a lot of chances where we can stop and reflect on what we've just read. So yeah, I mean, that's perception. Obviously, there's more than one type of perception. You know, we can have perceptions which are based, you know, in our day-to-day life. We can have perceptions of colors like, you know, green, blue, and red. All of those things are also direct personal experience. That the one, you know, the one that's significant is that direct personal experience which happens on the basis of deep meditation. Okay, so back to the Four Noble Truths. So reading again, we are back at the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is the Buddha's first discourse given to the 5 ascetics near Varanasi at the deer park at Isipatana. And reading from the text here. Now this is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same wanting, i.e. wanting related to the 5 senses, wanting for existence, wanting for annihilation, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, and Ajahn Brahm has kindly said, never letting it settle. So maybe if you've been exposed, to this particular teaching of the Buddha before, this might be something that's familiar for you. But to me, like if I look at this and I see the term never letting it settle, I wonder what on earth does that mean? Because the basic point here is that, what is the cause? Like why do we have this cycle of rebirth? And the answer here, like we looked at previously, it's referring back to the craving, which is for the 5 senses. So what we called the kama tanha, the craving for existence, the bhava tanha, and the craving for annihilation, which we called the vibhava tanha. So all of these things, it's a summary of the desire and craving, which keeps us, which ties us to the world. And what the Buddha is saying here is that the way to the end of that is to give it up. It's to relinquish it, is to be free of it. So all of these words, are synonyms for letting it go. Never letting it settle means, actually the Pali here is an alaya. So alaya means an abode, like a house. If the chickens go back to rest at night, that place where they go to rest or settle is their alaya. So, the mind doesn't find a resting place in the world. There's a sense of detachment. So that's what's meant here. It's not tied. It doesn't come to settle in that craving. So, yeah, that's the summary. And again, because we do need to keep through the material, we'll skip a little bit to the dependent cessation. Are there any questions at that point? Are we all cool beans? Is that so far so good? Because if we are all cool beans, I'm just looking at the chat, we can keep moving on. But if you are not cool beans, if there is something you don't understand, please feel free to point it out. Okay, we've got a thumbs up from Tina. That's looking good. Because like the other week, what we talked about dependent origination. We talked about dependent origination in the forwards order. If you know any Pali, that's called the anuloma order. So loma being your hair, so it's with the grain. It's with the grain, the forwards order. So how do we go from seeing something with our eye or having like sense perception? How do we go from that to the process of desiring and craving, and making new existence for ourselves in the world? So that's like the painful order. So now we're doing the not painful order. We're doing the backwards order, which is the patiloma order in Pali. So it's quite important to remember. Normally, like quite often when we look at dependent origination as a concept, it's normal actually to focus on the dependent origination sequence, but actually, what's important is actually the dependent liberation sequence, because that's the one that's the point of the Buddha's teachings, to put us on that path of liberation. So reading, this is the Dukkha Sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, the sutta on suffering. But with the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same wanting, tanha, comes the cessation of what Ajahn Brahm here has called fuel. Other sources have given as grasping, vedana. With the cessation of fuel, aka grasping, cessation of states of existence, bhava. With the cessation of states of existence, cessation of rebirth, jati. With the cessation of rebirth, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, unhappiness, and distress cease, such as the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. This is the passing away of suffering. So we went in the forwards order the other week, where we went from craving to rebirth, and here we've gone from the end of craving to the end of rebirth. Remembering again, the basic answer to why do we suffer in the dependent origination sequence is because we're born. So this is the sequence that shows the dependent origination of not being born. So very important sequence to know, and also a very common sequence. This sequence occurs relatively in a number of places in the Buddhist canon. If we could, we can keep moving through. And because we talked about Nibbana a little bit in weeks 1 and 2. I'm not going to go back over these points here that are being made about Nibbana, but I think the heading is very informative. So we have this heading here, Nibbana with residue remaining. So that being, Nibbana in this life, as opposed to Parinibbana, which is complete Nibbana, pari having the sense of like complete or the accomplishment of the action of a verb, which is also referred to as like Khandha Nibbana, because it's Nibbana meaning the breakup of the khandhas, the breakup of the body and mental constituents. So we'll go over that and not look at it too much, because we did talk about it earlier. But again, this definition of Nibbana, the destruction of wanting, the destruction of aversion, the destruction of delusion, this is called Nibbana, brackets with residue remaining. And again, this concept of an arahant. So this word arahant means worthy. So an arahant is a person who has let go of their ego. They don't have this fetter of conceit. They're a free person. So that's the goal of Buddhism, to become an arahant. An awakened being. Just obviously when you say Buddhism, the next logical question that would follow after that is, well, who's Buddhism? But, the Buddhism that we can historically attribute to a historical person known as the Buddha, according to what's been reliably preserved in Buddhist scriptures. What happened in the period after the Buddha's death was that Buddhism rose to prominence as, a religion that was adopted by King Ashoka and became popularized, maybe not quite as a state religion, but, it certainly had royal support. And there was a huge growth during that era in devotional cults. So there was a big growth in literature around stupas, around narratives, and a lot of interest in what's called Jataka or Avadana literature today. And in the Jatakas or the Avadanas, the hero of that literature is someone called the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva being the Buddha in his previous lives before he was awakened. And this literature eventually became, the dominant way that people encountered Buddhism in their day-to-day lives for most of Indian Buddhist history. So when when we have later intellectual and philosophical developments in Buddhism, it's taken for granted that the hero of Buddhism is this person called the Bodhisattva, who is the hero of the Jatakas. And because of that, Mahayana has taken this Bodhisattva ideal, where we have this concept of someone who purifies certain qualities over multiple lifetimes, as the locus for their inquiry of what does awakening mean. So it's just it's a historical quirk that's arisen from the popularity of narrative literature in pretty much most of the Buddhist world. But according to the Sutta Pitaka, actually the term we use is arahant. So it's not that anyone ever had an argument. It's not that like people got together and had a fight. Like, should it be, should we be trying to be bodhisattvas or should we be trying to be arahants? Like, that never actually happened historically. Some Mahayana texts, especially those from South India, that belong to a particular school called the Mahasangika school, sometimes they can be a little bit argumentative, and they like to create straw men out of this figure of the arahant. But again, not all Mahayana does that. And for most of Theravāda as well, this concept of the arahant this concept of the bodhisattva, it's relatively still relatively widespread, because people even within Theravāda have been exposed to the Jatakas, and it's not completely unheard of even within Theravāda for people to have this what's called a bodhisattva aspiration. So it's a slightly complicated concept historically of what is an arahant versus a bodhisattva. But the basic idea in all traditions is that a bodhisattva and arahant is an awakened being. Okay. So we're going to pass over that too. But again, just this lovely quotation from the bhikkhunī arahant Vajira. This is in the Samyutta Nikaya. She's explaining, like, she's awakened. What does her reality look like? And she's defined, like, this is the world I see it. I've seen suffering come to be, suffering that exists, and suffering fall away. So there's no person, there's no soul, there's no Atman, there's nothing permanent. It's just suffering coming to be and suffering ceasing. So that's her very beautiful statement of how she sees her own awakening. So that's all I really wanted to say about the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. I mean, I was really happy this week because I like to get to the point where we can talk about cessation and the way leading to the cessation of suffering, because it gets a bit tense, where we have suffering in week 1, the cause of suffering in week 2, and it's taken us about 4 weeks to actually get to the cessation of suffering. So I'm very happy that we've got into this. We've got in this far with the text. Okay, so that brings us to the fourth noble truth. And again, if there's anything unclear, just feel free to add it in the chat, or we can just keep going. So the fourth noble truth being the solution, the cure in the medical diagnosis model. So, curing the problem of why do we suffer? So again, the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering, reading from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya. So for anyone who's joining us for the first time this evening, this reference on the left-hand side is SN. S stands for Samyutta, or linked. Nikaya means a body or a collection of discourses. And this number, if you want to look that up, you can just copy and paste the whole number go to suttacentral.net, put it in the search bar without spaces, and it will take you directly to that link. So very convenient. So, what the Buddha is saying, he's defining the cure. There are these two extremes that should be avoided. The pursuit of happiness through the five senses, which is low, bracketed hina, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial, and the pursuit of practices that fatigue the body and mind, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without going to either of these extremes, the Buddha has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to wisdom, which leads to peace, to direct understanding, to enlightenment, to nibbana. It is this noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, right motivation, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right endeavor, right mindfulness, and right stillness. This is that middle way awakened to by the Buddha, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to wisdom, which leads to peace, to direct understanding, to enlightenment, to nibbana. So a few new concepts here. So again, the social context being that the Buddha is addressing the five ascetics in the Deer Park. And he's explaining to them, what actually is the spiritual life? Why did you five ascetics, you've left behind your families, you've left behind your careers, you've left behind everything, you've become homeless. What are you actually doing this for? What actually is religion? What is spirituality? What is the quest for spiritual knowledge? And straight off, the Buddha is saying this is what it actually is. So he's saying, first of all, it's not these two extremes. It's not where you just have this life of just giving into the world, where that's your whole aim, your whole aspiration. That's where your mind is heading, towards sensuality. And sometimes we have this term Hinayana, which is used in a slightly derogative sense towards people who aspire towards arahantship. But actually, what really is Hinayana? Hinayana is where your whole life is about sensuality. So the Buddha is saying, don't do that. And again, he's talking to these ascetics, and it's a little bit unclear, what religion they actually belonged to. Some of the later texts have said they practiced a type of yoga or a type of Sankhya, but actually it's equally plausible that these ascetics were Jains, and Jainism itself has a story where there used to be a follower called Gautama who left Jainism and went on to found his own school. So, there's it's equally plausible that they could have belonged to the Jains or some type of Jain sub-school. And